Carmel Cipollone.
Mr Speaker, that National Party MP just said, asked if Labor is caught in a paradigm where only the state can own homes. Mr Speaker, Labor believes that the government has a major role to play with regards to housing, and that we shouldn't be hawking off $20 billion worth of assets that have been built up since that very first State House was built in 1937 on 12 Fife Lane in Miramar, Mr Speaker. So this isn't just about Labor, this is about generations of New Zealanders who felt that this was the right place for their government to invest their money, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, this bill is further evidence that the national government has lost its way. They are arrogant, they are out of touch, and they are ignoring the big issues facing everyday New Zealanders: jobs, wages, and of course, relevant to this bill, the housing crisis. They are a government of broken promises, Mr Speaker. Under National, the Kiwi dream is slipping away. We have an economy stacked in favour of a privileged few, while everyday Kiwis find it harder to get ahead. A healthcare system stretched to breaking point, slashing services to the tune of $1.7 billion over 6 years, denying Kiwis the care they need, Mr Speaker. We've got an education system drowning our young people in debt. Mr Speaker, we've got rates of child poverty that are a national disgrace, with too many kids going without food, living in cold, damp houses, or relying on charity for basics like a raincoat or a decent pair of shoes, Mr Speaker. And last but not least, we've got a housing market that has become a plaything for speculators, locking a generation out of the dream of home ownership, Mr Speaker. And this bill, Mr Speaker, is only supporting that to happen, is supporting that lockout of New Zealanders from that Kiwi dream, not only to own their own home, Mr Speaker, but to get into a home, Mr Speaker. And we know there are so many families who are currently not even in a home, living in garages, living in cars, couch surfing, Mr Speaker, because they don't even have access to a house. I, like many other people in this parliament, have talked about the fact that my family, like many New Zealand families, started off in a state house. Mr Speaker, that was the stepping stone to being able to then go on to buy a home. That was the stepping stone for my parents. That was the stepping stone for many people's parents in this house, including the National Party leader, the New Zealand Prime Minister, John Key. The point of difference is that this side of the House never pull the ladder up, Mr Speaker. We don't pull the ladder up on other New Zealanders that need the same opportunity, unlike that side of the House, and we've seen it done so many times. Time and time again, they use their background, they use the challenges that their families were faced with as a platform for trying to appeal to New Zealanders, and then they turn around and they remove that very same opportunity to the New Zealanders that require the same opportunities, Mr Speaker. This is an absolute disgrace of a bill, and one that sums up National's blind obsession with selling off state housing, with absolutely no foresight. They act like they are the economic gurus of this country, like they are the only political party that knows how to manage the finances of this country, and yet they go ahead and make the decision to sell the biggest asset that we own as a country, the $20 billion asset that we own as a country, Mr Speaker. They make the decision that that's worth hocking off. But of course, Mr Speaker, what we have to keep in mind is that privatisation is just business as usual for the Nats, regardless of the consequences, regardless of the fact that they're seeing every day, and I'm sure they are across the country, increasing levels of homelessness. They're seeing a number of New Zealanders coming through their offices, I'm sure they are like we are, who are getting sick because of the damp, mould and unhealthy conditions of their homes. Mr Speaker, they know there is a shortage of housing. We all see there is a shortage of housing. Not only do we have a massive queue of people on that social housing register, but we have thousands of New Zealanders who can't even get on that social housing register because there is a shortage of housing. That government tries to say that selling off these houses is their way of addressing the housing crisis. It doesn't make sense, Mr Speaker. They are not increasing the stock of housing available. They are shifting the stock. They are shifting what belongs to New Zealanders and passing it into private hands, Mr Speaker, and we will not support that on this side of the House. Mr Speaker, I personally, and I know a lot of other people in this House feel the same way, are absolutely shocked that the Māori Party have made the decision to support this bill, Mr Speaker. I don't know whether they've been asleep during this whole process. I don't know whether they've seen the way in which the housing crisis has been affecting their community, Mr Speaker, but it is shocking that the Māori Party has made the decision to support this bill. Mr Speaker, the National Government are sellouts with regards to this bill, and every political party in this House, including the Māori Party, has sold out on New Zealanders as well, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, what's the point of their so-called benefits of being at the table if they do absolutely nothing to stand up to the government when it matters? And this is an issue that the Māori Party should have stood up against the government for. This is an issue that they should have stood up for their people for, Mr Speaker, but they didn't. They've supported this bill. That's on record now, and that will not be forgotten, Mr Speaker. This bill gives Ministers English and Bennett extraordinary and unprecedented powers to take direct personal control of selling state houses, exempting ministers from normal legal requirements and leaving the sale process wide open for corruption. And actually, I heard my colleague Stuart Nash last night in the House speaking about the fact that our brand as a country that is so far removed from corruption because of the fact that people perceive us as not being corrupt is worth around $20 billion. Well, isn't it a coincidence that that brand being worth $20 billion, this is the same amount of money that our state housing stock is worth, Mr Speaker? Because I tell this House what? That side of the House selling out our $20 billion state housing asset is basically selling out our brand, Mr Speaker. They are selling out New Zealanders, they are selling out the country, and they are selling out our brand. National wants the power, Mr Speaker, to do dirty deals, flogging off billions of dollars worth of land and housing, and it doesn't want to be bothered with pesky public servants or the rule of law. It is having secret meetings, and we know this, with merchant bankers, with PPP investors and property developers who want to get their hands on these assets, and refuses to release the names of these organisations. There is no transparency with what this government is doing, Mr Speaker. They are not accountable for the decisions that they're making, and actually the legislation reinforces the fact that there is no accountability because of the fact that despite the fact the minister, so Paula Bennett and Bill English, are going to have all decision-making power with respect to these transactions, none of the accountability or liability will fall on them if anything goes wrong in the transaction. All of the accountability and liability will fall with Housing New Zealand, despite the fact that Housing New Zealand has just had a national government take all power for decision-making off them. How can that be right, Mr Speaker? How can that be fair, Mr Speaker? Anyone looking at that bill when we were going through committee stages could see that. This is wrong. This is incredibly wrong, and the national government should be ashamed of themselves. Mr Speaker, this bill is the latest move by a government desperate to offload state houses and keep its troubled policy afloat. National State House sell-off is deeply unpopular, and as I said before, generations of New Zealanders believed in this investment. They believed that their taxpayer money going towards state housing was the right thing to do. In the latest poll, 75% of New Zealanders and 60% of national voters oppose the government's plan to sell off state houses to overseas companies like Gold Coast-based Horizon, Mr Speaker. In light of the housing crisis, we should be trying to solidify the availability of the number of homes available to low-income persons, not take them away. We've been accused on this side of the House of being ideological, but I'll say we're not ideological, we're responsible, actually. We're responsible on behalf of New Zealanders, and we're responsible on behalf with regards to the asset that has been built up by New Zealanders. There is only one side of this House that has been ideological in this debate and with respect to this legislation, and that is the national government. They do not believe that the state should have any role in housing, and they've been so quick to make the decision to hock that housing off. We will not be supporting this bill in the House, and I want to make it clear as well, the national government know that this is a deeply unpopular policy with the New Zealand public.